All right, we'll see if that works. There we go. So quickly, a public service announcement. So that is hand sanitizer. Hopefully it's anti-bacterial. It says kills 99.99% of germs. I would just encourage us, because we do care about the people who are on our sick list, and we don't want that to grow. So if we all do our part, maybe we can keep that from growing by us not getting sick. So there's a lot of talk these days about the coronavirus, and there's, of course, a lot of just regular flu and things going on. So I would just encourage all of us to do what we can to make sure that we're using Lysol and Clorox and all those things that are supposed to keep stuff around the house clean, and that we wash our hands regularly and all that good stuff that they're telling us about, so that our sick list doesn't grow, because we don't like it when our family here is sick. So I would just encourage you to do that, okay? And I promise I will do that as well. So this morning we're going to talk about something that I'm very experienced in, and that is tending sheep. Back from way back in Ohio. No, we didn't. I didn't. Matter of fact, when you see the picture up there, and Ashley showed it to me, I thought it was a cow. I'm pretty limited. But thankfully, because of a couple things, the internet being one, and then the good book being the other, you can find out about sheep and shepherding. And so I want to talk to you today about really the Good Shepherd, and really about whether or not we listen for, hear, and recognize his voice. So I will share a little bit background from just in general knowledge that I was able to gather. Sheep itself, back in the days of Jesus in Palestine, they were kept in what they called sheepfolds at night. And these were usually structures that, either because they were built that way, or they had some kind of walls or some kind of protective barriers like a cave or even a mountainside. That's where they would keep sheep at night, because during the day they would take them to graze and take them for water. And so they would keep them in these sheepfolds to protect them from wild animals or to protect them from robbers. And the shepherd was very much a key part of this whole thing, because he stayed with the sheep really 24/7. He lived with the sheep. He slept with the sheep. He often slept in front of the doorway or the opening to the sheepfold, just to, again, protect those sheep from any kind of wild animals that might enter, or from anybody that would try to come in and rob or steal the sheep. And so very much a part, the shepherd, of this flock of sheep that he would be charged with. The shepherd spent so much time with those sheep that he would get to know them well as you can get to know a sheep, and he would name them. He would give them names and call them by name, and he would talk to them often. And they got to where they recognized their shepherd's voice. And that's important, because others would try to come and steal the sheep and lure them away at times, but if the sheep knew the shepherd's voice, they would not go with a stranger. And so throughout the day, he would refer to them many times by name, even while they were moving as a flock, just to reassure them of his presence. The shepherd was that integral to the life of a sheep, because basically a sheep, pretty defenseless. Show of hands, anybody ever get attacked by a sheep? You did, Marcia? Marcia may be the only one in the world that was ever attacked by a sheep. So basically, sheep are pretty defenseless and pretty harmless. They're pretty docile. And if left to themselves, they're going to just kind of repeat the same things they always do. They'll walk the same trail until it's nothing but a rut. They'll pasture or feed in the same field if left to their own, to where before long nothing is left but dust. And they'll pollute that field, and it'll turn into nothing but disease and full of parasites if there wasn't a shepherd to lead them and keep them moving to where there was fresh food and fresh water. Many times the shepherd would take the sheep out early in the morning. And sometimes he would take them, especially if there wasn't a field nearby that was good for eating, he would take them into the desert areas, because again, there was desert in Palestine. And many times during night, because the nights in the desert would be cool, little sprouts of plants would shoot up. And so he would take them out there and they would eat those little shoots of the plants that sprouted up. And then by midday, he would take them to get water somewhere. And then again at night, he would make sure they had a place to stay so they would be protected. It was pretty much a routine that they had. And the shepherd, again, was in total charge of where the sheep went and how they were taken care of physically, as well as how they were protected. And so that was pretty much the life, if you will, of a sheep and a shepherd back in Jesus' day. And even if the people themselves in Jesus' time didn't tend to sheep or didn't own sheep or weren't shepherds, those were very common in that part of the world. So they knew about and understood this idea of what it meant to be a shepherd and what it meant to keep sheep. And so Jesus, in his wisdom, he would often talk and give lessons, and he would use things from the area. He used fishing, and he used sheep, for examples, and sowing or planting, if you will, to help bring out a message. Well, today we're going to look at where he talks about sheep. And he does that in such a way to try to bring a message. But before we do that, I just want us to look again about sheep. And one of the great things about a shepherd is that he always walked in front of the flock. Because if you tried to drive a flock from the back, a flock of sheep, they would scatter. And of course, trying to catch them and corral them again would be difficult. So he always was in the front of the flock. And he was in the front of the flock for a couple reasons. One, so they could see him, and two, so he could watch out for danger. Danger, whether it be, again, from some animals that may be out there ahead of them, or from some robber, or just simply from the terrain of the land. He would watch ahead of them. And they could see him. The flock could see him. And throughout that time, he would often talk to them. And again, call them by name just to reassure them that he was there and that he was with them. And if for some reason a sheep got away, many times the shepherd would either leave the flock of sheep in a field where they were grazing, or possibly even give that sheep, or that flock of sheep rather, to another nearby shepherd just to watch over for a while he went to find that lost sheep. And then when he did, because they were so docile and tender, he would reassure that sheep and bring it back to the flock. This was the life, if you will, of a shepherd. And so the people in Jesus' day knew that. And so because he was such a great teacher, why wouldn't he use something they were familiar with to try to teach them a lesson? And we're going to look at that in just a second. But just to review very quickly, see, there's the picture. I thought it was a cow. So, but a shepherd in Jesus' day protected his flock. He made sure that they were free of danger. He made sure that he led them in places where they would be safe. And he protected them at night as well. He kept guard for them. The second thing that a shepherd back then did was he knew his flock. Again, he spent most of every day, if not the entire day, with his sheep. He would do so and even name them by name and call them by name so that they could also know who he was as their shepherd. So he knew his flock. He was known and trusted by his flock, again, because they recognized his voice. But beyond that, because they could see him, because the shepherd was always in front of the flock, leading them where he could be seen. So they knew him, and they trusted him, and they knew that he would protect them. And then the fourth thing that a shepherd in general back in Jesus' day would do is, again, he led his flock. He had a predetermined destination in mind every day. Because, again, he had to make sure they, A, went someplace where they could eat, B, went someplace where they could find fresh water, and then also, C, have a place where they could be safe and rest at night. And so it was up to the shepherd to do those things. And so he led his flock. And so that was kind of the way that it went. Well, Jesus talks about this in John chapter 10, and we're going to take a look at that. And if you want to follow along in your Bibles in John chapter 10, that's fine. But we're going to look at this chapter because he talks about sheep, and he uses sheep as an analogy to try to emphasize some points that he wanted to bring out to his audience. And so we're going to take a look at that. So we're going to start with the first 6 verses. And Jesus is speaking, so these are his words. It says, I tell you the truth, the man who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The man who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The watchman opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all of his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. And then in verse 6, it says that Jesus used this figure of speech, but they did not understand what he was telling them. Even though they understood sheep, and they were very familiar with that in their region of the country, they couldn't put the imagery together to what Jesus was trying to refer to and what he was trying to teach them. So Jesus tried again. He took a little different approach, and he went more from a general to a more specific way to talk to them, beginning in verse 7. So let's take a look at 7 through 15 and see how Jesus kind of went to that more defined teaching when he talked about these sheep. Again, Jesus is the one talking. He said, I tell you the truth, I am the gate for the sheep. All who ever came before me were thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. He will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. In verse 11, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd who owns the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man who runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. Verse 14, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. Jesus isn't talking now about the four-legged sheep. He's not talking about the shepherd that has the staff and spends all day with them, kind of going from place to place. He's talking about himself. And he got very specific. He said, I am the good shepherd, and here is what you can expect from me. And he gets very, very specific. You see, even though he was a great teacher, because he wasn't accepted so much by the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the religious leaders of the day, he was considered an outsider, but he wanted to make sure the people who were listening to him understood who he was and what they could expect from him. So, as the good shepherd, here's what they should come to expect based on what Jesus talked about in those verses, beginning in verse 7. Jesus is going to protect his sheep as the good shepherd. He's willing to lay down his life for his sheep. And more than that, he loves them. And first and foremost, he is going to do anything to protect them. He also cares about them both as a flock as well as individually. The second thing that they can come to expect from the good shepherd is that he's going to know his sheep. They're going to recognize his voice because he's going to speak to them often. We have the benefit today of Jesus speaking to us often. All we have to do is look and find his words in the New Testament. They recognize his voice. There's a special bond between shepherd and sheep. And because they know his voice and he knows the sheep, it indicates that there is a desire on the part of shepherd and sheep to form a strong bond, a strong relationship within the flock. The third thing that his listeners can expect and that we can expect from the Good Shepherd is that he is going to lead his sheep. He has a course for his sheep to follow. He has a defined and planned out destination for his sheep. His example gives his sheep confidence because they're going to see him leading and they're going to know who he is as their leader. And while some might wander aimlessly, some sheep may do that, Jesus, as the Good Shepherd, wants to bring them back to the flock. He doesn't want them to be lost. But there's one more thing about the Good Shepherd that his listeners can count on. And it's found beginning in verse 16. Again in John chapter 10. And Jesus is still speaking. So it's his voice right now that they're hearing, and really his voice that we're hearing. He says, starting in 16, I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them in also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. So that one other thing that Jesus wants to have and wants to see happen as the Good Shepherd is he unifies his sheep. He wants to unify and to unite, not to divide. The other sheep that he talks about, the other sheep represent people from other nations, people from other lands, not just the Jews, but eventually the Gentiles. And he says that eventually they are also going to become part of his flock, and he's going to be their shepherd. His desire is to have unity among his sheep. And God gave Jesus that authority. He gave him that responsibility as the Good Shepherd. So here we have Jesus talking to this group and really speaking to us today, saying, you know what, here's what you can expect from me. All you have to do is become one of my sheep and be part of my flock. Back in Luke chapter 15, Jesus again is talking, and he continues to talk about sheep. And this time, it's a specific audience that he's talking to. In chapter 15 of Luke, the first 7 verses, the first 2 verses really tell about who are the listeners, if you will. It says, now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear him. But the Pharisees and the teachers of law muttered, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. Before I read the rest of that, I just want to say sometimes I think it's easy for us when we sit and listen and there's a scripture that talks about those tax collectors that robbed and cheated people, that get a bad reputation, and then those sinners, well, guess what? That's us. That was us. So we could say, yeah, those sinners, man, they were terrible, lowlifes, undesirable. Well, okay, yeah, we got to look in the mirror. But Jesus has this group gathered. They want to hear him. And so he's going to talk to them and give them this parable to try to teach them a lesson. He said, suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Does he not leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. And then he calls his friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me. I have found my lost sheep. And he goes on to say, I tell you that in the same way there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent. The tax collectors, the sinners, the undesirables of the day that would cause those Pharisees and the teachers of law to be critical of Jesus, saying, look who he hangs out with. But Jesus wasn't a respecter of persons. He didn't care if you were a prince or a pauper. He wanted you to be part of his flock. And so the same is true for us today. Jesus wants us to be part of his flock. He wants to be the good shepherd in our lives. Over in 1 Peter, Peter is talking here, and I have to believe that Peter would hear these lessons from Jesus when he was with him for those 3 years during Jesus' ministry, and he heard Jesus talk about sheep, and he's going to refer to sheep even in this little passage in 1 Peter that Peter's going to talk about. So in 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning in verse 22, and just reading 4 verses through 25, he starts out this way. He quotes from Isaiah. He said, "He committed no sin, no deceit was found in his mouth." So he's talking about Jesus to his readers and his listeners. Then he goes on to say, when they hurled their insults at him, he didn't retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. Okay, here comes Peter's referral to sheep. For you, like sheep, were going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. Jesus, the good shepherd, is there. But this morning, I guess, the question would be, what about you and what about myself? Are we part of that flock? Are we following Jesus? And I would say for the most part, we could easily say yes, but you know your situation, and I am not going to judge that. All I know is that Jesus wants everyone to be part of his flock. You see, a day's coming when Jesus' voice will be the only voice heard. A day's coming when all the other voices that people listened to throughout history are going to be silenced. Some may hear Jesus' voice for the very first time. Not because he never tried to reach them, he never spoke to them, but because they never listened to his voice. For those people, that will be the one and only time they hear Jesus' voice. They'll hear it once and never hear it again. Others are going to recognize his voice at those last days, at that day when we are called to heaven, when we're called to judgment. And those who have been in his flock are going to recognize his voice because we've heard it and we've followed it in our lives, because he's the good shepherd of ourselves. So this morning, 3 quick questions as I close. Number 1, and again, you answer this, not me. Are you following the good shepherd? Are you one of the sheep in his flock? Do you know his voice and follow it? See, if he isn't your shepherd, then you're either following another shepherd who is not going to get you to heaven, or you're like those sheep that Jesus referred to, and you're just wandering aimlessly, and that's not going to get you to heaven either. So this morning, as we think about sheep and shepherds, don't listen to my voice. Listen to Jesus' voice as he spoke in John 10 and as he spoke in Luke. He wants to be your shepherd. He wants you to follow his voice. If you're not doing that, would you do that now as we stand together and as we sing the song Ken has picked?